This is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Noodler's X-Feather Blue. I'll be doing a writing sample on 52 GSM paper using a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'll also take a look at some writing samples that I did earlier using papers of varying quality. I'll compare Noodler's X-Feather to similar inks from my collection. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test. Writing with Noodler's X-Feather using a glass dip pen was very enjoyable. The ink came off the nib very uniformly. The swatch that I did with my tweezers had a little bit of trouble holding on to the paper, but swatches I did on other papers were nice and crisp. The swatch on Tomoe River paper was pretty uniform from beginning to end, but the drip at the end of the swatch, I can see a little bit of dark blue sheen. I'm going to begin with a Pilot 78G. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. This ink is very well suited for an extra fine nib like this. It feels nice and smooth, and with it being very saturated and dark, the legibility is very good. Next, I'll be writing with a Pen BBS 494. It has a stainless steel fine nib. I chose this Pen BBS 494 fine nib instead of a Pilot stainless steel fine nib just for comparison's sake, because I used Noodler's X-Feather Black in this pen for a long time and it performed really well. Now, this nib writes similarly to a Pilot steel nib, the little small number 5 steel nibs, but it is a bit drier. And I noticed that when writing with this pen and ink combination, it feels dry, but it's still very smooth. Next, I've got a Pilot Grants. It has a 14 karat fine nib, and you can see how this ink tends to really coat certain nibs. The first two pens that I showed, this ink did not tend to stick to the nibs too bad, but most of the pens from here on out, for some reason, this ink really did coat the nib and stick to it. This 14 karat fine nib is much wetter than the first two, but the Pen BBS nib was much smoother. I wouldn't call this nib smooth. This nib is not as smooth as the fine nib on my Custom 74. It's not quite as smooth as that nib. There's a bit of feedback, but it's still nice. Next, I've got a Sailor LeCool. It's got a stainless steel medium fine nib, and again you can see how the ink sticks to the nib. I could have wiped that off, but since I'm dip testing these pens, it would have just been a never-ending job. Now my scribble here feels a little dry. I may have to re-dip it, and all that ink on the nib may be forming a little dry crust that's keeping the ink from flowing. Well, I didn't have to re-dip it. It's flowing. Let's just see. Okay, I'm having some skips here, and that just tells me I'm needing to do some long-term testing with this ink. I don't know if it's just because I've dipped it and it's kind of drying on the nib and I haven't wiped it off, or if it's going to tend to dry out even if I ink up a converter. And it felt a little dry. Next, I've got a Kaweco Perkeo. It has a stainless steel medium nib. Normally, I describe the writing experience with this Perkeo as a pleasant chalkiness, but with this ink, it just feels velvety smooth. Very nice. Next, I've got a Pilot Metropolitan. It has a stainless steel calligraphy medium nib. And I love just saturated, smooth inks in this calligraphy nib, and just like with the Perkeo, it is velvety smooth. A pleasure to write with. Next, I've got a Kaweco Lilliput. It has a stainless steel double broad nib. Not super wet, but glassy smooth. A pleasure to write with. And finally, I've got a Jinhao X750. It has a 1.5 stub nib, and with this big surface area, I'm concerned about this nib hard starting. And that's what I thought. This ink that collects on the tip dried out and made a little crust that gave it a little trouble starting, but once it gets going, it's very enjoyable to write with this stub nib and this just really rich ink. And again, not super wet, but very enjoyable to write with once it gets going. While that dries, I'll take a look at some other writing samples that I did. My writing sample that I did on Rhodia, the swatch, you can really see a gradient from dark to light on the swatch, but I'm not seeing much sheen. Only 2 of the nibs gave me any trouble at all. The LaCool had a little trouble getting started, and I think that's just because I dipped the ink and maybe the nib wasn't entirely saturated. Kind of like the trouble I had with the Pen BBS. I really had to keep dipping it, and I thought it just wasn't going to work. And finally, after dipping it several times, I got it to write pretty smoothly. Now the LaCool, as I was writing this little note to myself, I had thought the LaCool would be a good student pen. It looks nice, it's not very expensive, and this would be a good ink to use in school. But this particular nib on Rhodia just didn't feel that pleasant. I marked it out. This would be better, just a quick note-taking pen. But everything else was very pleasant, especially the extra fine nib. Like I mentioned before, this ink is very well suited for fine nibs. On my 20-pound copy paper, the first thing I looked for was, does this ink feather? And you can see the letters do look a little ragged. I'm not seeing much difference between the other writing samples. Polar Glow has that similar raggedness. So does Noodler's Red Black. Let's see. And Noodler's Navy maybe looks a little more ragged. But everything else looks pretty similar. I'm not seeing anything that stands out that would warrant the name X Feather, other than when I flipped the page over, the writing samples that I did with X Feather did have noticeably less bleed through than the other writing samples, so I don't know about it being resistant to feathering, but it does resist bleed through. And the only pen that I didn't prefer on copy paper was the Percao, because it felt too wet and too dry at the same time. You can see some of the letters. It goes from being too dry to too wet, but everything else was very enjoyable to write with. I tried to find a paper that was really prone to like the little hairy looking feathers, and I had an old 5-star notebook, Mead 5-star, and these are some old writing samples. Let me see. You can see some little feathers on this Murasaki Shikibu and on Fuyugaki. So a lot of these inks, I was seeing the little hairline feathers. So I did a few writing samples. I didn't use the big nibs, but I started out with the Metropolitan calligraphy medium. But I'm seeing some little feathers, the little hairline feathers with it. Now these aren't terrible, it's still usable, but I'm not seeing any difference between this ink and these little hairline feathers and the other inks. Now the extra fine, it looks good. No, not even any of the little hairline feathers on it, but I'm sure that would be the case with almost any ink. And finally, my little writing sample that I do in my Leuchtturm bullet journal. I don't know if it'll show up in the lighting that I have here, but I do see with this 1.5 stub some of the dark blue sheen. It doesn't, that's not sheen that's just in your face, but it's nice and subtle and just makes the writing look a little more interesting. This ink looks like it has a little purple to it. It looks a little more blurply in real life, so I thought it might bleed through this Leuchtturm paper. Purple inks tend to be the main offenders on this paper, but no problems. On my Tsubame ink collection card, you can really see that dark blue sheen on the ink swatch. The closest thing I had was Diamine Oxford Blue, but it has very little water resistance. And judging from the scribble, it looks a little wetter. Noodler's Kung De Ching is similar in color, but a little less saturated, and I really did not like how it performed. I wrote this with the same glass dip pen that I used on the Noodler's X Feather, and you can see how Kung De Ching just really spreads. Noodler's Bay State Blue performed a little better. It didn't spread as much, I should say. It still feathered a little bit, which is unusual on this Tsubame paper. And it's a very different color blue. Noodler's X-Feather Black performed similarly to X-Feather Blue. When I compare how it writes in this Pen BBS 494, the writing experience was very similar. Now, I haven't done any long-term testing. Long-term, X-Feather Black performed very well. I left it in this pen for months, and I would just do little bits of writing with it at a time, and it never dried out in the nib. It always started up right away. So I'm curious to see if X-Feather Blue performs that well. Noodler's X-Feather Blue and Black are both very water resistant, but I have to give the nod to X-Feather Blue. It did not move at all. X-Feather Black tends to blow out just a little bit, but it's still very water resistant. Okay, let's take a look at the Tomoe River paper. No bleed through at all. Nothing even close, even in the heavy bits of the swatch and the scribble. The only pen that gave me any trouble at all was the Lacoule. And I have to say, on this paper and the Rhodia paper, the Lacoule wasn't pleasant, even if I discount, the little hard starts and skips. But if you're going to be writing on copy paper, the Lacoule performed great. If you're going to be writing on more fountain pen friendly paper and you need an extra fine, this ink did really well. I really liked the Pilot Extra Fine. And I liked the 494 once I got the nib really saturated, once I got the feed really saturated. It's a really dry, so it not putting much ink on the paper and being a good performing ink and that nib being smooth, that was a good combination. Performed nicely. Oh, I just really love these two velvety smooth ones though. And I think I have to give the nod to the Pilot Metropolitan. With this cursive medium nib, it writes a little bit drier, so it performs better on the copy paper. I think overall, my favorite pen to use with this ink is the Pilot Metropolitan, and my extra fine 78G is a close second. One thing I wanted to mention about this ink that I didn't notice with the black X-Feather, the black X-Feather ink seemed very watery and did not stick to the sides of the vial, but the blue tends to really coat the sides, and it does the same thing with nibs. So I don't know if that's going to affect the overall performance of the ink. I tend to think with broader nibs where you have more surface area where the ink can dry out on it, you may see more hard starts, but the finer nibs, I don't think that would be much of a problem. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.